Hello and welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I'm of course your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 255th episode, our guest is Robert Nickelsberg. Robert Nickelsberg worked as a Time magazine contract photographer for nearly 30 years, beginning in El Salvador and Central America from 1981 to 1984. He is the author of Afghanistan, A Distant War, published by Prestel, and Afghanistan's Heritage, Restoring Spirit and Stone, done in conjunction with the U.S. Department of State, published in English, Dari and Pashtu. His latest book, Legacy of Lies, El Salvador, 1981 to 1984, will be published September 3rd. And now on to the show.
So my name is Robert Nickelsberg. I'm a photojournalist and began this profession in the late 70s. I traveled to Central America as that particular news zone was very active following the 1979 ouster of General Somoza in Nicaragua. And I began basing myself in El Salvador in 1980-81, where I spent 4 years for Time magazine. I became from a freelance, I became a contract photographer, which means you get an annual contract, you're not salaried. And it was a weekly publication, so things were happening daily in El Salvador as the Civil War took off. And I think at that point in time, television was still film. They weren't, electronic, and things were very much on an analog basis. So that's my foundation in the profession is film. And I eventually moved to Brazil from Central America, and then over to Bangkok, Southeast Asia, and then that lasted 2 to 3 years. And then with the Soviet Army still in Afghanistan, I moved to New Delhi and worked out of the Time Bureau for South Asia for almost 12 years, and got to countries that I had not been on my bucket list at that time, but turned out to be professionally and personally very rewarding and very interesting.
Yeah.
And with that, I took a bit of a leap into the Middle East and covered the Iraq War, the second one, and back to Afghanistan. That's, in a nutshell, my throw the dart at the world.
Yeah. And, when you're shooting on film, you really have to, make it count, right? I mean, with digital photography, you can just take as many pictures as your memory card will hold and see what comes out in the wash later. But, when you're shooting on film, you really have to be very intentional about it. So I'm sure that, that was an extra degree of difficulty kind of in this more analog world that you were shooting in, I guess.
No, absolutely. But remember also on top of it, I sent my film to New York unprocessed. I never saw the film.
Wow.
You could not process Kodachrome, Ektachrome in a developing country. It just wasn't possible. But also that was the method. You put your film into designated caption envelopes, went down to the airport and sent it up as cargo. And it got to Miami, for instance, if we deal with Central America, it got to Miami, and then it moved to a domestic flight to New York. So you had to time your film arrival appropriately, because Friday night was the deadline for a magazine as a weekly, and the result came out in a printed form on Monday. So you had to get your best stuff there early if it was Kodachrome early in the week, and then because that would have to be shipped to Kodak for processing outside of New York. Time had a lab within the building to process Ektachrome and black and white. So towards the end of the week, you shifted to more the efficient film, and you worked on a weekly basis. That was your time clock. But again, not seeing the film
Hmm.
was um, not great, but it also meant how good a relationship you had with your editor to in a 2 minute phone call find out how you did. You know, how does it look? Did the flash work? Uh, you know, was it in focus? You know, just things we take for granted now because you can see it digitally. But I had to hand over everything to the desk, and I had the same editor, so we had a pretty good working relationship personally and socially. But I would only go up maybe every 4 months, 5 months to New York to actually look at the film. You could not send the film back for me to look at. It would never get through customs.
Ah.
So, um, particularly in a war zone, why would they let your film back in? I mean, they rip it off, get rid of it. So, um, these are layers of the challenge and the complexity. And you're right, this made things more difficult.
Mhm. Yeah, and I finished reading your book today, and it's a pretty harrowing retrospective of your time there. Um, I wonder if, you've captured such horrific images in many of your photographs, and obviously being there had to just be terrible and at times, but did the camera give you some level of remove from the, horrors that you were witnessing on the ground? Because, you're able to be, when you're taking photos, you can be more focused on getting the shot and, framing things and kind of just going into work mode as opposed to being just nakedly confronted with the tragedy of it all. Is that, did you find that you had some kind of remove through the camera, I guess?
Well, as an individual, you experience the same thing that Salvadorans did. And, but at the same time, as media, as press, we were given a certain amount of license to perform our profession, and it was respected.
Hmm.
Uh, most 99% of the time. I mean, there were journalists who were definitely fired upon and killed or who
Hmm.
died, or they hit a landmine, or yes, you were not invisible. And, but getting rid of the messenger at that point in time was not really to the benefit of the government. They had to come, you know, or they were held up to certain standards because of the American aid or international aid to respect uh, free speech. They would claim that the host country would claim that we were respecting it. Of course, they violated it all the time amongst their own people. But we were looked at as not having we didn't have a vote there. Our uh, uh, purpose was to document and send out of the country pictures that may or may not reappear within El Salvador, for instance. So, what the local government was more worried about were local newspapers, right?
Hmm.
Who they could influence the staff and threaten and kill, make life difficult, hold up a bank loan. They could do anything they wanted to local staff. So we had that. We were in a bubble in a way, and you certainly had to learn how to use your the bubble environment, but not abuse it. And since I was living there, it was different than somebody coming in for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 10 days, a week, and not really being more oblivious to that. Like I didn't want to be a bull in a china shop. I
Hmm.
needed to be patient, wait. I would get it, and you build up trust and you build up your contacts and familiarity by being there regularly. They got to know you, but the authorities, that still did not exempt you from the violence.
Mhm.
And we were there to document what the local people were exposed to, that violence. And we were witness, they were witness, but our job, our responsibility was to capture that and send it out to the world in form.
Mhm.
The At that time, it seemed almost a miracle that Salvadorans, when we arrived, two or three or four individuals or two or three or four cars to a situation, the Salvadorans actually welcomed that. Please show the world what we are facing,
Mhm.
was very often what we heard, or silently welcomed us because they were powerless. Now, security forces and their supporters in the right wing uh, had mixed feelings about us because that's the nature of the game. Um, they're up to something, and they didn't really want that totally revealed. Uh,
Mhm.
and the better you got at this, the more you could reveal. You could figure out um, by luck, by intelligence, your own, being clever and timely, you could see what the narrative is, what the drama, how it unfolded, and be a step ahead.
Right. That's an interesting contrast with the how the medios were treated. What about the American government? Because obviously, I've done pretty a lot of reading about what was happening in Nicaragua at that time, and obviously the CIA was very active in South America during this time. As you point out in the book, it was kind of the new, resurrecting the domino theory, for a new age, and all the consequences that had for that continent. But what about American authorities that you were showing some things I'm sure that they didn't want public, right?
Um, the embassy was in a bunker, and there were nets all over the place, so you couldn't throw grenades in, from a passing vehicle. The walls were 4 feet thick. They were not permitted to go out, staff, without full security and bulletproof vehicles. So they were themselves prisoner. Um, the the diplomats. Now you had your intelligence people who worked differently. You had your AID, Agency for International Development people associated with projects out in the field, and you had military advisors and trainers who were they did not want to be inside. In fact, they functioned in the field. So the idea on a daily basis was to keep communications open with the embassy. My housemate was the time reporter, so he would often work in the city at the embassy or at Salvadoran government or Salvadoran organizations, human rights, church, um, students, universities, people under threat. And I would go into the field on a daily basis. And at the end of the day, we would compare notes. Um, he was not a visually driven person, and I am a word driven person, but I'm there to illustrate. So um, I knew all the people in the embassy. I went to briefings without a camera. I accompanied the Time reporter. I needed to be educated about the place. You need to know what's going on with the major power there. What are they up to? What are they thinking? And again, like my relationship with the civilians in Salvador, I tried to maintain an open and perfunctory, performative relationship with the American embassy. It just made sense to know what the public affairs officer was doing, to know who the military attaché was, what was he doing. And I therefore I would get on trips to watch them train the Salvadoran Navy. Um, whether that was ever used in the magazine, who knew? But I wanted to have a 360-degree view, and that included them curious about my encounters with the guerrillas, the leftist guerrilla movement, the militant movement, which they did not have any access to. So the power was through the power of the Salvadoran society. That's how the U.S. exercised through the military and through the rich and the industrial community. And we were a party to that. We weren't part of any group, for instance. We were observers. And the more knowledgeable you were, the more I found the more access you had, and they listened to what I had to say. I listened to what they had to say. Whether we believed each other was another matter, but um, I would bring as much credibility to the table with the United States presence there as I possibly could. And that also helped the reporter, who was an American. He had to do the same thing with his contacts. And in a conflict zone, things are changing minute by minute. And you found that on a Tuesday, you barely remembered where you were on a Monday because things are moving quickly. But that still forms your foundation of what the powers that be are thinking. And it just helped me going down the Pan American Highway, knowing that there are 3 U.S. military advisors in San Miguel at the garrison, or 4 at some other location, and I could perhaps try to get a picture of them. But if you didn't interact with the embassy, they're not going to come knocking on your door and say, here, go find the 4 military advisors. You had to pursue it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Um, did you have any, I know you said that you couldn't see the pictures you took at the time and ahead of time, at the moment that you took it. And did you have any sense of how your work was being received back in America? Because this is obviously, completely foreign to the average American at this point, until you're illustrating it for them. So did you have any sense of the reaction back home?
Well, let's go back in time 40 years ago. Time magazine also had a Washington presence, their reporters and photographers. They had State Department reporters. They had Pentagon reporters, right? So the journalism at the time was sort of a homogenized concept. They took whatever the story was, and we proposed a story from Salvador every week. What we thought was coming up, what we could not necessarily deliver, but promise. And then they would take that in New York and see, did this match what was coming out of Washington from the State Department or Defense Department, and see if we could put something together. So there was more than one voice than us. And often, if the State Department did not want to address what we were coming up with because it was too soon, it needed to be held discreetly for another couple of weeks. And if the Pentagon felt under pressure that we were getting too close to saying constantly, which we did, that the Salvadoran military were losing, why would they want to tell Time Magazine that, that we're not doing great? Plus, every 6 months, Appropriations Committee in Congress had to approve aid to El Salvador to make sure that they were improving human rights conditions. Otherwise, they would not approve the aid. So we knew we had a very significant story every 6 months, guaranteed, because it would X-ray or um, describe the situation as it went to Congress. And every official had their point of view, pushing what the White House wanted them to say, whereas we were independent. We could say this is a crock. What are they talking about? There are 30 people killed this week, and they say their human rights are improving. Well, last week it was 40. This week it's 30. So there was a lot of smoke and mirrors that from the field, we were there to sort of counter whatever the government would say or agree with it. But it was never a happy situation for how the war was going. And remember, back in that day, it was post-Vietnam, which was a defeat for the United States. Defeat. They would not admit that. And they were still using Vietnam tactics, counterinsurgency, which failed in Vietnam, and they were applying those in El Salvador. Not going to win on a losing plan. So we knew that, and we could capture that visually. And there's some pictures in the book which show it. This 60 soldiers crossing a river all bunched together. Now, if there was a machine gun on the other shore, they would have gotten them all. That's not the way they were trained by the Americans, is you spread out in a single file, 10 feet apart. But they just couldn't be trained. So we were constantly testing what the US government was putting out there as what their mission is. And okay, that's what you say it is, but here's what it looks like. And that's not the same. And then they would have the State Department reporter interview some people, sometimes off the record, sometimes on, or what the Defense Department would say on the record, off the record. And the CIA, there was really very little access to them. The way there's more of that now in the general flow of news that you get, because they realize that having a public position on certain things kept their legitimacy high and their credibility, what they claim to be their credibility. But you had to gather your own intelligence back then, and it was for the reporter very difficult, and you couldn't count on it. For instance, you had to go to the Canadians or the Germans or the British or some other source than the Americans to say, this is what we're hearing. Can you, does that sound right? Can you confirm? What do you think? And again, without revealing who they were, you could say a European source, which you've seen in texts. That's how you gathered the information. And my pictures would often illustrate and back it up. I would only have one picture on a page after sending up 500 images on 20 rolls. That's actually 720 pictures, but you only got one picture in the magazine for a week's worth of work. So that picture had to be good, in demand, and work on the left side or the right side. It had to pass muster with guys in coats and ties. It didn't. I didn't edit that. So the long answer here is it's a little bit more complicated on how digital photography is done by the photographer. Edits, you send your edit up, and that's what they have to work with. Whereas they got my whole laundry list: socks, pants, underwear, shirt. They got everything. And I could say, well, look at roll number 10. That pertains more to what the reporter is talking about. And they would look at it and say, yeah, well, the editors want to use that. They want to use something else. So my editor did not have autonomy. What she could do was put together a persuasive edit, say 10 slides. And no, she knew what the article was about, but she also knew what Washington had an input. So it wasn't just El Salvador. It was Washington also.
Right.
And that is not so clear today because it's sort of a collage. But in the analog world, that's how it was put together.
Right. You had to go through a lot of these photographs for the first time in a long time, or maybe ever, right? Because you hadn't seen, some of these were undeveloped pieces that you hadn't ever had a chance to look at. What was that experience like all these decades later, looking back on your work then? Did it make you reconsider anything from that time, or what kind of feelings did it bring up, or how was it looking? Because I'll look at stuff I wrote half that long ago, and I'm like, who are you?
Yeah,
Like,
right.
what
Was that me?
person?
Yeah.
I couldn't.
Well, I shot 2 camera bodies with color, one in black and white. Shot 3 cameras. So the color was what Time wanted, because they were going to a full color magazine from a former black and white magazine. And color they could convert to black and white. So I kept shooting black and white regardless. And they processed it, but they never edited the black and white. So the book we're talking about here was just black and white, which sat in a box, unedited, unpublished for 20 years. And there are contact sheets, but the film had not been taken out of the glassine envelopes. And there were staples, there was Scotch tape, stuff that is archivally toxic, so I had to, so looking at the black and white, and I'll go a little bit technical here, black and white has a higher sensitivity. Tri-X is ISO 400. Kodachrome is ISO 64. You have no latitude in interiors with Kodachrome. It's pitch black. And I found by seeing for the first time, maybe 10 years ago, that, oh my God, there was something there that I was looking. Color. You couldn't use flash. These were awkward situations, but I got it in black and white. So my whole narrative, my through line changed. And I was the editor, whereas for the color, the editor was in New York, right? But with the black and white, I own the film, I own the copyright. That's the thing about not, if I'm salaried, they own the film, but as an independent contractor, I own it. I could do what I want with it, and I did. These were pictures that I had worked really hard to get, but I couldn't quite get the same environment of the interior, say, of these situations, of a room with a 15-watt light bulb. It would be impossible to get with Kodachrome unless you had a tripod and, cable release and just things that were very awkward to have and just didn't work in a conflict zone. So I sort of rewrote my 4 years there with the black and white, and I found that exhilarating, absolutely sensational. And I would sit back in the chair and go, holy smokes, I did get that. But I had to brush away the dust and the cobwebs of my memory to crawl backwards in time, where I actually revealed it clearly and in focus then, whereas I put it out to pasture if it was just the color, because I didn't, I had to work with perfect lighting. Now, these weren't National Geographic situations, where it's, all right, you didn't get it, so go back 3 times to Outer Mongolia. I'm not going to go back and recreate the conflict. So you had to be, as you said, you had to be very precise with the color, but I could cross my fingers and hold my breath with black and white, and I might get it. And I never saw that. till 2013. And we're talking 1981 to 84. So, it's a long, and the stuff literally sat in a box. And my wife would say, would you please move the box out of the hallway? When are you going to get to this? It was like, maybe tomorrow. So finally, I hired an intern, and we put it all together, chronologically. And I saw that these are impactful images, and I could more clearly describe what was going on then with some distance. Now, you come back with a lot of adrenaline, after 100 days in a conflict zone, and you have to decompress in order to properly edit a lot of the stuff. But I didn't do that. I'd come back, get new film, see the doctors, get my teeth checked out, whatever, and then go back down with new film, more money, and start all over again.
Mm-hmm.
So that I can't say that that's a very healthy method for the profession, but that's I occupied 24. I was 24/7. I don't think there was a day we didn't work.
Right. Well, great. Well, we're running out of time, it looks like, but is there anything else that, I know we could talk for much longer about this and everything else, but is there anything else about the book in particular that we didn't get to that you think is important for people to know?
I think it's important to hold on to your work and to revisit it, re-edit, review what you saw, contemplate again, give it some time and space, and don't throw anything away. And now digital, it's you can store it on a hard drive, but even with a digital file, to go back and re-edit makes a lot of sense. And I think now that people spend so much time thinking about the next minute, the next second, but to slow down and re-examine what you've done. And I think there's a big reward in that.
Great. Well, one question I do always ask at the end here is, what music have you been listening to lately?
I listen to a whole variety of music, but essentially it's music that keeps me going while I edit. So it can go from Eric Clapton to blues, to Pat Benatar, to as long Huey Lewis, any things that have fast beats, and so I can go through the edits quickly. But I also go to opera and physically go to the Met. So I'm all over the place with music, but
Yeah.
Professionally, what helps with an edit is rock and roll, good guitar music, and for recreation, it's to the opera and classical music.
That is very eclectic. That's great. Yeah, I probably have more experience with the Huey Lewis end of that spectrum than the opera, but I do need
that. Right. Well, the opera is always a challenge, no matter how long you've been going. But yeah, I've got a couple of friends that go regularly, so I just tag along and listen to them.